The following is a special presentation of KTVA 11 News. Legalizing marijuana, increasing the minimum wage, Anchorage and its unions squaring off over how to work together, to mine or not to mine near Bristol Bay. 4 issues that could change the fortunes of Alaska. 4 issues that have divided us. 4 issues that will unite us as we go to the polls November 4th. Tonight, hear from the stakeholders who believe with great passion that they know issues best. How can you prosper in the ever-changing landscape of living life in the 49th state? Show me the money, Alaska's fiscal future. We take you now to the studios of KTVA 11 News.
Good evening, I'm James Gaddis. Thank you for joining us for this special presentation of KTVA 11 News. Tonight, 2 issues on which you'll be asked to decide November 4th. The repeal of AO37, which will return more power to Anchorage municipal unions, and the proposed increase to Alaska's minimum wage. We've gathered stakeholders here to the studios of KTVA News to discuss both sides of these issues, and we think you are in for an engaging evening with them. The fight over Assembly Ordinance 37 is one of the more complicated issues facing Anchorage voters. Mayor Dan Sullivan wants you to vote to keep it, and municipal unions want you to vote to get rid of it. Here's KTVA 11's Dave Laval with a little background.
For 25 years, unions representing policemen, firemen, and thousands of other municipal employees could bargain with the city on increased pay for specialized training or for earning a college degree. Unions had a say in scheduling and overtime. And of course, if working conditions changed, non-APD and AFD unions could strike and seek binding arbitration. That all changed in 2013 with the adoption of AO37, also called the Responsible Labor Law. Mayor Dan Sullivan wanted to make the municipality more efficient and save money, giving his government management rights that reflected what goes on in the private sector. More importantly, it stripped unions of their right to strike and seek mediation from a third party. Union reps argued the law interferes with the ability to recruit and retain essential workers, and that quality of life for its memberships would fall. Feeling pressure from city employees, the Anchorage Assembly voted to repeal AO37 in August. However, the mayor vetoed the measure, sending the fate of a labor law that affects police, firemen, and residents of the city to the voters in November.
And joining me now at the table are the people here to talk about AO37 and the effort to repeal it. We'll first introduce you to those who want to keep that labor law on the books. We'll start to my right. We start with Mayor Dan Sullivan, a lifelong Alaskan. He's been elected to 2 terms as mayor. Before that, served 3 terms on the Anchorage Assembly. And with him to his right, Chris Birch, who served 3 terms on the Assembly starting in 2005. To my left now, Anchorage Police Officer Angelina Fraze. Officer Fraze has been with the Anchorage Police Department for nearly 8 years. She is joined by Captain Tom Westcott with the Alaska Professional Firefighters Association. He's been part of the Anchorage Fire Department for more than 14 years and is a captain for the Station 5 in Spenard. So that is the table. And folks at home, this isn't a formal debate, but more of a conversation with people on either side of the important issues of the day. We've asked them to keep their points under a couple of minutes each so we can have a free-flowing conversation. We'll begin with some quick opening statements, and Mayor Sullivan, we'll start with you first. Mayor, if you could take the next 60 seconds or so to tell us why AO37 should stand.
Well, James, thank you. I want to thank KTVA for the opportunity to give us the information available to the public that they will need to make a decision on November 4th about Proposition 1. I'm urging, of course, a yes vote on Proposition 1 to retain the law. And I think it's helpful if folks have a little bit of context about why the law was put into place in the first place. One of the reasons, of course, is in 2008, the mayor introduced labor contracts, the Assembly ratified labor contracts that were the most expensive, longest-term contracts in city history, which would have been fine under normal circumstances, but we were in the midst of the worst recession in 70 years. Revenues were known to be declining in the city, and yet we dramatically increased city expenses, one of the worst business decisions in Anchorage history. I was elected in 2009 to protect the taxpayers, and one of the things that we did to protect the taxpayers was make sure that business decisions like that could never happen again. And when you look at the further context behind it and you see what the motivations were, we understand that Mayor Begich, based on an independent audit, essentially broke the law by not informing the Assembly of the economic situation in the city at that time, which is required by law. Then if you look at the APOC reports of the 6 assembly members and the mayor who rammed through these last-minute contracts, heavily financed by public employee unions. Now, public employee unions have the right to support candidates. They do it because they want influence. That influence manifested itself into these contracts. Again, the worst business decision in Anchorage history. I was elected to fix it. We've done it.
All right, thank you, Mayor. Captain Tom Westcott, why should we vote no on AO37 come November 4th?
Well, AO37, address a few things the Mayor said. AO37 is a law born out of a bad process, and bad process creates bad law. It's unsafe, it's unfair, and it's going to hurt all of Anchorage by reducing services. You know, the Mayor talked about the 5-year contracts, and that wasn't the first time 5-year contracts had been passed. Mayor Mystrom did it upon his exit. So I realize they want to pick a boogeyman and do what they do. And he brought up the political contributions, and he'll know that our union was supporting Senator Stevens at the time we were negotiating with. There was a change at the last minute after an indictment, but we have a long record of supporting Senator Stevens while we were negotiating with the former mayor. The contracts, these individuals to my right, they want to create fear out of fiction. And the actual reality is the unions have always been able to come to the table and work with the city in time of true need. It's been displayed many times. As a matter of fact, when we did come back in 2009 because of the recession, it passed 11-0, and Mr. Birch is one of the individuals that voted for our concession. 11-0, and he got on the microphone and he said, "Thank you guys for coming forward and doing what you've done here." So what's important to realize is that the old law worked. Mayor Fink was able to operate under it. Mayor Mystrom was able to operate under it in a conservative fashion. Nothing prevents individuals from negotiating tough stances. What this new law does is it reduces the ability of professionals to weigh in on critical issues of staffing and service levels, and that's going to affect the public.
All right, well, let's get into what AO37 does. We'll kind of go line by line almost. We'll start with the elimination of binding arbitration. Over on the S side, simply put, why do you think that's a better solution for the city?
Let me jump in real quick on that, and then Chris can respond. Your opening intro actually was incorrect. It said that it eliminated binding arbitration for the collective bargaining units. Only 2 have binding arbitration, just police and fire. All the others have regular arbitration, which means their contracts go to the assembly for final decision making. So that was incorrect at the opening. So binding arbitration means that an arbitrator, typically from outside the state, comes in and makes a decision about what contracts should finally read. We think the elected officials who are responsible to the local voters should be the ones making those decisions, because then the voters have a recourse if they don't like the decisions that those folks made. They can vote them out of office and say, "We didn't like that decision." You can't do that with an arbitrator that you have absolutely no control over.
No?
Binding arbitration is very difficult for the general public to decipher. It's very difficult. I tell my friends and family, basically what I think of binding arbitration is 2 adults disputing over maybe a property line in their neighborhood. And they can talk and they can shout at each other, they can do whatever they want back and forth, but they both know that if it comes down to a civil hearing, there's going to be a fair and impartial person, and we can link that to an arbitrator to make a good and fair decision. We'll look at the finances of the municipality, we'll look at the needs of the workers and the 24-hour service members and the safety of our public, and make a fair decision. By taking that away, I think that decision, it reduces it to like a parent and a child discussing what's for dinner. The child can say whatever they want about what's going to be for dinner, but we really know who's going to make that decision. And I just think it's fair for someone like me, just a regular police officer, to know that someone has my back, to be able to just sit down and have that fair discussion with our employers.
All right, we'll move along. Oh,
can I weigh in also? The process created in AO37 is a flawed process because it tilts the scales so far in one side. What the mayor didn't tell you is that if an arbitrator, if we do go to arbitration under this, and he selects, let's say, our side, we now need 8 votes. The mayor, what he knows is it's very difficult to get 8 votes on the assembly. If we don't have the 8 votes, then it goes back to the city's last best offer. That will so influence the way they come to the table. He's going to know who's on the assembly, I've got these guys. I don't care what the arbitrator does because they don't have 8 votes. I've got assembly people that are going to vote with me no matter what. That's politics. That's how politics is played. It's a bad, flawed system. Arbitration is like MAD, the old nuclear policy in the Cold War. Neither side wants to use it. We lose in arbitration as much as we win. You don't want to go there. It forces individuals to negotiate in a reasonable fashion. You go to the table, you negotiate, you give, they give. You get a good deal for both sides, and the Assembly ratifies it.
But what Tom doesn't mention is that 7 of our 9 unions have the system where it goes to the Assembly. So it clearly works. The vast majority of our union contracts are ultimately decided by the Assembly. There's only 2 that have binding arbitration. So to say that those 2 are somehow different than the other 7, I think is a misnomer. It works. The Assembly has been the arbitrator of 7 of our 9 contracts for all these years that he has talked about, and it seems to work.
All right,
I think binding arbitration, I would just echo some of the earlier comments. It's bad for the taxpayer. It basically puts and it's an accountability issue. The accountability needs to be on the elected officials, the Assembly, the mayor, and those people that are actually held accountable by the voters. And so ultimately, binding arbitration takes it out of the hands of the taxpayers and their elected officials and puts it in the hand of an outside, a non-resident, often a non-taxpayer. Thank you.
Chris, we'll stick with you for a second. And also, AO37 strips away the right to strike. Why is that in the best interest of the city?
That's basically the law of the land does not guarantee the right to strike to public employees, and it's because of the vital nature of that contract and that agreement and those services that it's not fair. It's not fair to the taxpayer, and it's not fair to the public.
Yeah, and let me just add, the Supreme Court has ruled that public employees do not have the right to strike because the public should never be denied essential service because management and labor are in disagreement. So, and keep in mind that once again, we're talking about 2 different sets of rules for different unions. Police and fire right now do not have the right to strike. It's the other 7 unions that are having the right to strike. So again, in the opening, it referred to all the unions, but there is a difference between them.
Okay. No, is that something you feel as if you should have the right to do? Is that something
we have never had the right to strike as long as I've been around here.
The fire department.
The firefighters,
right.
The police officers, nor do we want it.
Nor do you want it.
Let's be very clear.
I think a lot of people don't realize that.
That's
what
right.
about the other unions? I don't know if you want to speak on their part.
The other thing, let me just quickly touch on. We haven't had the right, we don't want the right, and that's why you've had binding arbitration. Because binding arbitration came in and settled differences when you couldn't do it. And again, they paint the picture that it's always a lose for the taxpayer. It's not always. We're not guaranteed a win in arbitration. Arbitrators like to work. Each side reviews them. You don't get arbitrators that give huge union awards. They never get employed again because they get scratched off the list every time by the other side.
James, let me just say that, again, echoing that we don't want the right to strike. It's never been on the table. It's not something that's being taken off the table. It's not something that we can do, and we wouldn't want to do. People who are in this line of work, first responders, they love their jobs, and that's really what this debate is about, not power and money. It's about our ability to be safe at work. And, when patrolling the streets, I didn't want to go home to my children. And having the essential backup, the firefighters, trained professionals, paramedics right around the corner is something that I can tell my kids if something happens to me, they're right there. And that's really what this debate should be about. The community services. And are they there? Are they being provided? And will they be long term? We can talk about the past and we can hassle over that, but the future is what the community needs to know about, how this will affect the community and the safety.
All right, the future, and we certainly appreciate the clarification. Again, this is also an educational hour here. We need people to fully understand what they'll be voting on in November. We're going to move things along now. AO37 also eliminates bonuses based on seniority. When we come back, we'll discuss that. And one of the more controversial provisions, which gives the community the ability to outsource some jobs. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We now continue our conversation on AO37, the city's labor law, and we'll kind of pick up where we left off. We were kind of going through the rundown of what AO37 does, and one of the things it does is eliminate bonuses based on seniority. I'll go to the no side. Captain Westcott, I mean, a lot of people would say, shouldn't bonuses be based on performance?
Well, I think it's for the two sides to sit down and come to agreement on, negotiate over. What I will speak to the one contract I know, which is the fire contract, and we don't have any type of longevity type pay. We pay a fireman as a fireman, depending on their skill level. We pay a captain as a captain, depending on their skill level. It's not based on time. Once probation is complete, you're a functioning member of the team.
Okay. Angelina, as far as police are concerned, is that something, where do you fall on that?
Yeah, I agree that wages should be based on performance, and that's the majority of what we have in our contract. We are mostly concerned with attracting and retaining qualified employees, and we're struggling with that. To be honest, we need boots on the ground right now. We are down, when I started 7 years ago at the Anchorage Police Department, and 5 years ago, we had 35 police officers on each shift. Right now, we're working anywhere between 15 officers in Anchorage, 3 in Eagle River, sometimes up to 25 officers, but that's still a huge reduction. Our 911 calls are going unanswered for minutes. People are waiting 3.5 minutes for their 911 call to be answered. Our dispatchers, our officers love what they do. They want to do a good job, and the resources just are not there. They don't have their backs to be able to do that. So, we can talk about wages. We can sit down at the table and negotiate. We've been able to do that, and we want to continue to do that. We want that seat at the table. But right now, we need to focus on getting people here and getting them to stay.
I know we're kind of going down the line of what AO37 does, but I believe this is a big crux of what the conversation is all about. And the unions will tell you that this hinders recruitment, it hinders retention. AO37, what do you have to say?
Well, next week I'll be congratulating 20 new police officers who just graduated from the 3rd academy that we've had in 1 year. We've added over 65 officers in a year to the police force. There's been some attrition, certainly. In fact, some of the contract provisions encouraged a great retirement in 2014, but we've been making that up with academies. We're attracting people. Again, there'll be 21 in the class, one's injured, so we'll actually be honoring 20 next week. So we're getting back to the level of force that we need, but what's really important are results, not numbers of how many officers you have. Over the last 5 years, overall crime in Anchorage, Alaska, of the 7 crimes that we report to the FBI, Part 1 crimes, are down compared to the previous 5 years. So it's results that matter, not how many people you have. It's really, we're a results-oriented organization, and 5 of the 7 Part 1 crimes we report are down over that 5-year period as well. So we're doing something right.
I think it's important to note as well that a yes vote on one will preserve fair pay. And fair pay is, obviously is very subjective, but when you look at the municipality as a whole, across our 3,200 employees, the median salary and compensation is $130,000. So half of the municipal employees are above $130,000 and half are below in total compensation. I believe the top employee this year, or for 2013, was almost $300,000. And these aren't for the chief. This isn't for the chief. This isn't for the the lead person. This is basically the median, $130,000. So I think the fair pay component is, it's obviously very subjective, but the fact remains that that's the largest single component of our budget, and AO37 serves to address that with responsible sideboards on that increase to CPI plus 1%, not double the rate of inflation like we experienced in the 2008 labor agreements, but it puts some sideboards on there, reasonable sideboards. So a yes on one is about fair pay.
Do you think the fair pay weighs with, carries enough weight that we'll be safe enough because of those fair wages?
I think what Anchorage needs to realize is that we have to be competitive. We have to be competitive with Washington to attract police officers, linemen, whatever it is. We have to be competitive, firefighters, paramedics. The mayor put a little bit of political spin on the staffing levels around the city, and Mr. Birch has been, itching to bring up the wages. The biggest jump in wages we've had over the last 5 years is in overtime. The mayor gave a press conference here a little while ago, and it was a great example. They said, hey, now that the state agreed to put this issue on the state ballot, we're going to save some money. And he said, we're short some paramedics, so we have some good news. And then he caught himself, and he said, well, we're not really short, but we've been moving some people around. But what's really going on is we're asking people to work the equivalent of 2 jobs. It's not healthy for them. And then we berate them when they do answer the phone every time and take that overtime and work for the city. Well, I think we're all in agreement. The overtime is bad. Let's bring the staffing. Instead of spending $4 or $5 million on overtime in the fire department, let's hire some people with it. When we have that earthquake, when we have a volcano, when we have some kind of disaster, we're going to wish we had those 100 police officers and those other firefighters on the job instead of relying on people to work the equivalent of 1.5 to 2 jobs. And aside from asking them to do it, it's not healthy in the long run for those people. The sleep deprivation, the stress, all those things that factor in.
Well,
Mayor?
Just in response to that, I've never berated a public employee. Let's get that straight right from the start. The other thing is, we could easily accommodate by shifting personnel until such time as we were able to hire new paramedics, which we proposed. We're the ones that said, let's add to the force. We want to make sure we're properly staffed. But in the meantime, the chief has some options at his disposal. He was using those options. So, you know, to say that we're not interested in increasing staffing, that's why we're having our 3rd police academy in a year. That's why we're adding paramedics. We believe in properly staffed public safety force, just like anyone. But again, we're a results-based organization, and the results are outstanding. We're a lower crime city than we were 5 years ago, and our response times in all areas of the fire department have improved. So again, let's look at the results.
I think you need to look at the institutionalized overtime that's built into some of these labor contracts with the inflexibility to where a manager doesn't get to assign who has what overtime. So we have a situation right now where, you know, with police officers in the school, where it would be helpful to go to a 5/8, you know, basically to match what the city or what the school district sees as a requirement. But if the contract calls for a 4/10s, then it requires 2 officers. But if the contract and the union are inflexible in that, then you have to staff a position that should only require a single person is actually got to be staffed with 2. So it's that kind of institutionalized you know, overtime that really goes against the taxpayer. And a yes on one will preserve AO37 and will preserve management's ability to manage the workforce as they properly should and as the public truly expects.
I was going to say, oh, go ahead, go ahead.
Go ahead, Angie.
I was just going to say thank you. That overtime is absolutely a management tool, and many times, at least on the police side, there's many employees that don't want this overtime. It's forced overtime. For example, you can look in the book at what my salary is and my overtime. Almost every hour of that overtime is forced on holidays that I don't have the ability to take that off. I'd rather be with my family. These are issues there are issues in AO37 that we want to have the conversations about. We want to talk about. We want to negotiate those things. Nobody's saying on our side that we don't want to have those conversations, but we think it should be a fair process, and that's what we believe. So overtime, absolutely a management tool, and we're willing to work with them. We want more officers, so we don't have to have the overtime.
All right. Well, I know one of the more.
We're graduating an academy next week, adding 20 new officers. So we get it. We've been working on it. We've had some attrition over the years, but we're making up for it. So our commitment to public safety has never been stronger. The equipment we provide, the training, the academies that we've authorized, all go towards the point that you've made. So I agree with you on that.
Just real quick.
Real quick, you know, I would bring up, in 2008, there were, I believe, 410 budgeted positions in the fire department. There's about 375 now, and the voters have added rigs in the meantime. So we're doing more with less people. What's the give? The give is overtime. And it's a management choice that this mayor has adopted. This is how he is going to run his services. He's going to have less people and pay them more. So when Mr. Birch talks about the increase in the wages of everybody, again, the biggest factor increasing wages over the last 5 years is not the contracts, it's the overtime. You want to cut my pay 20%? Stop calling.
All right, we need to move it along.
I have to correct that, though. That is incorrect. The contracts of 2008 dramatically increased wages even without overtime. That's a given.
The biggest factor.
With all the other performance incentives in there, the longevity things that were contained in those contracts, those are wage drivers regardless of overtime.
All right, we're running short on time, and I wanted to touch on this because I know it was a controversial topic, and that's the outsourcing of jobs that AO37 allows for. Why do you think this is in the best interest of the city? when you have your own workers right there?
Basically, it puts the municipal employees in an opportunity. It gives them an opportunity to be competitive with the public. For instance, the Anchorage School District, they plow snow with their own employees when they would have an opportunity. Not certainly, although this doesn't affect the Anchorage School District. Public schools are plowed with municipal employees. When in fact, it might be more competitive to have that outsourced. So the idea of having managed competition it's happening in Indianapolis and across the country, and it basically gives public employees an opportunity to compete successfully in the market and basically assure the taxpayer that they're getting a competitive value for the services provided.
And just as clarification, which unions are we talking about here when it comes to this?
Well, it doesn't apply to police, fire, EMS, any of the public safety professions are not eligible for managed competition. You're talking things like mowing grass, plowing snow, as Chris mentioned, some of those perfunctory functions that oftentimes are done in the private sector. And in a competitive environment, again, as Chris said, the taxpayer gets the best value for his money.
I'd like to touch on that a little bit. I think the mayor in his own handout indicated that the previous law didn't forbid discussing managed competition or outsourcing, however they want to classify it. So they could already do it. They didn't need this law to do it. Secondly, if they sat down at the table and negotiated over these issues. Secondly, and even the mayor, he's also kind of warned this. He said, hey, we want to do this the right way because we have a lot of examples of the private sector maybe not doing so well for the taxpayer. We have a payroll system that's $20 million over budget right now. We have the example of the Port of Anchorage, a giant fiasco that have not proven to be good for the taxpayer. So we have to be careful when we start, there's the potential to be political favors and handing out contracts to friends. It's something that should be discussed. Nobody says it's not. It was allowed under the old system.
Well, let me just say, it was not allowed under the old system. If you have to negotiate that same provision with 9 different unions, our previous labor person, who's now moved on to another career, said she tried for 7 years to try and get the unions to agree to a standard holiday schedule. They couldn't agree to a standard holiday schedule, yet less something like managed competition. So that's why it was important to enshrine it in law so that you don't have to sit there and try and fight over it union by union by union when we couldn't even get consensus on something like holidays. And let me just answer on the Port of Anchorage. The Port of Anchorage is a project we inherited. The mess when we came into office was identified. The Gaddis administration had completely mishandled the port project, but it had nothing to do with managed competition. This wasn't a public project that should have been done by the private sector. This was a project with private contractors managed by the federal government. The federal government did a horrible job managing it, and the Gaddis administration did a horrible job keeping an eye on the project overall. So that's not a good example for managed competition.
All right.
That was never in a competitive...
The example was about the private sector working for the government, not necessarily managed competition. But what would you say about the payroll system?
Well, the SAP system is not just a payroll system, it's a complete enterprise system handling all the
$20 million
functions,
over budget.
Which is, one of those things that, again, the previous administration failed to maintain.
All right, guys, I think we could probably have this discussion.
We had to change the system.
Previous administration's at fault for the
They
payroll
failed
system?
to maintain PeopleSoft, and when you fail to maintain it, you have to replace it. Because PeopleSoft would no longer support the system.
All right.
It had to be replaced.
Our special presentation of Show Me the Money, Alaska's Fiscal Future, is far from over. When we come back, a new panel to talk about Ballot Measure 3, the push to up Alaska's minimum wage. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We now shift focus to another issue. Voters will be asked to decide a raise to the state's minimum wage. Supporters think the extra money will help pull some of our neighbors out of poverty. Detractors, they say otherwise. Ballot Measure 3 would raise the state's minimum wage to $9.75 starting New Year's Day of 2016. That would make Alaska the state with the nation's highest minimum wage. KTVA 11's Dave Laval shows us how Ballot Measure 3 could help families across the state, or could be a meaningless gesture that may, in fact, help no one.
With the economy right now, we really need help.
Tui Youngbauer has worked at the KFC on Northern Lights Boulevard for 39 years, yet she struggles each month to make ends meet, even though Youngbauer makes $9 an hour. That's already above the minimum wage.
Really difficult because $9 and you have to pay all bill right now. It's really difficult to live on.
That means doing without some things most of us take for granted.
I already cut the cable out so that way, we can save a little money to pay some bill.
Youngbauer and others in the same situation hope to take home more money. Alaska's minimum wage would rise to $8.75 January 1st, 2015, and rise another $1 the following year. It would mark the first increase in Alaska since 2010, and the $9.75 wage would be the highest minimum wage in the nation. That's a big reason supporters are pushing for the ballot measure. They see it as a way to improve the quality of life for all Alaskans. There's no formal opposition to ballot measure 3. University of Alaska Anchorage professor Kyle Hampton argued the minimum wage is pretty much an arbitrary figure that does not necessarily lift people out of poverty. However, Youngbauer says every cent will help her family as she continues recovering from a stroke.
I cannot do a lot of things. I have to relax a little bit to get my stroke.
Youngbauer believes more money in her paycheck will help her do that.
Well, will it do just that? Tonight we have 4 people who will help us better understand both sides of the issue. First, we have UAA economics professor Kyle Hampton. Professor Hampton is the director of the Center for Economic Education. Joining him, Rachel Petro. Since 2011, Rachel has been the president and CEO of the Alaska Chamber of Commerce. Before that, she served as deputy commissioner for the Alaska Department of Administration. Now to the yes side of the debate. First, we have Ed Flanagan. Mr. Flanagan is a former Alaska Labor Commissioner under Tony Knowles and is leading the push to raise the state's minimum wage. With him, Pastor Susan Knight from the Emmanuel Presbyterian Church in Anchorage. She grew up in Alaska and is a graduate of UAA. She has a strong interest in social justice and equality issues and is a member of Christians and Equality and the Anchorage Interfaith Council. We want to thank all of you for being here tonight with us, and we'll start, I should say. We saw the struggle of Tui Youngbauer, and she's already making $9 an hour, and she believes that increase would help. The question is, would it? And Kyle, I'll start with you. You said that a wage increase offers a short-term solution to a long-term problem of poverty. Could you explain that a bit?
Well, I think the big issue that folks like myself on the no side have with this particular policy is threefold. For starters, it doesn't really help those folks who are most in need in our communities. Those tend to be folks who aren't capable, whether it's through skills or circumstance, those folks who are not capable of actually getting a job in the first place. A lot of the benefits have been shown for the minimum wage to actually accrue to young people, teenagers, who are already members of fairly well-off families. So it's a solution that doesn't really address the problem that we're interested in addressing. In addition to that, the costs that will necessarily need to be borne by society in order to increase these wages tend not to be those folks that we would most want to pay those costs, those folks at the top of the income scale. It actually tends to be the customers of Walmart and McDonald's, places where you would see these wages rising, who are going to pay those higher wages in the form of higher costs. But really the biggest issue as far as this policy and what I see to be its harm is that it gives the impression that we're actually helping. And what that does is it makes it less likely that we start to explore those other types of alternative policies that could make much larger inroads into dealing with issues of inequality and poverty in our communities. I hate to think that a person thinking that they go to the ballot voting for this measure is doing something significant to help when there's so many other things that we could be doing that would be more effective.
All right, yes side, I'm going to get you in just 1 second. Rachel, Kyle, how do you tell someone like Tui that a bump in the minimum wage, more money in her pocket, isn't going to help her? I mean, how do you explain that to her?
Well, I absolutely think that's a very difficult thing to explain. And I think, as Kyle said, over the short term, absolutely, she would see that difference. The problem is that she probably shops at Walmart, maybe even shops at McDonald's, and over time, those costs will go up. So cost of living just goes up. And so it's a false solution, unfortunately. And I absolutely agree with what Kyle has to say about let's look at the real problems instead of masking it. Minimum wage increases over the past 100 years have not helped bring people out of poverty. We have the same percentage of poverty-stricken families today as we did 100 years ago.
All right, Ed, I know you certainly disagree. More money in their pockets, a good thing right away, short-term, long-term?
Good thing right away. There is no way to tell Chewy or the other 48,000 workers that will benefit from this increase that it's not a good deal for them. The argument about Walmart, where taxpayers pay $6.2 billion a year to subsidize Walmart's low-wage employment through public assistance, or the fast food industry nearly $7 billion to allow them to pay the substandard wages. We're already paying it. She's already paying it through her taxes. Alaska there's 24 states that have a higher than the federal minimum wage largely because of the total inadequacy of the present federal and Alaska minimum wage as a result. Alaska was the first state to say we're going to have a higher minimum wage. Our first legislature in 1959 did that. Federal minimum wage was $1. They said Alaska's going to be $1.50. That kept us the highest in the country, that 50 cents differential, which was 50% when it first started, for over 30 years. Now we're in 19th place. We're behind, we don't have to be #1, but we sure as heck shouldn't be 19, behind Florida, Arizona, and if this initiative were not to pass, we'd be behind West Virginia. Don't have to tell you, it's a heck of a lot cheaper to live there, and prices and wages are much lower. And it's ridiculous that we'd be behind states like that and so many others, and dropping if we don't act soon.
Reverend Knight, is this state have in any way a moral obligation to the people to make sure that they have a wage that they can support themselves with?
Absolutely. I also feel, excuse me, that the morality of it is that we are to, as the Golden Rule says, love our neighbor. And we are to treat our neighbor as ourselves. And I was impressed by the woman's look on her face of pride as she talked about, you know, she would now be able to afford something more. She has already cut her cable, she says. Cable is such a vital service to have for people, especially in the villages. Places that are now reached by cable, some by satellite dish, but we have the moral obligation to walk in their shoes. We have the moral obligation to make them feel as much a part of society as anybody else. And I think raising the wage, basic minimum wage, would be a step in the right direction. I think there needs to be a lot more done yet. But that would be a step. And I think it would give some pride of ownership in the state and in the government, that people say, well, someone is looking out for me.
Right. No side, Rachel. Kyle, does the state have any moral obligation to its people, so to speak?
I would agree with her that we as a people have a moral obligation. And frankly, you know, the Alaska Chamber, we represent hundreds of businesses all over the state. We fund schools, all the state programs, schools, troopers, roads, you name it. And we love where we live, and we should absolutely be reaching out and taking care of our communities. And our businesses do that. We have the most giving business community in the nation. We fund more nonprofits here in Alaska than anywhere else in lower 48, and we're doing good things. So I do believe that that moral obligation is there, but fundamentally, we don't believe that it's the government's role to do that. So we as a people, absolutely. Government setting an arbitrary minimum wage floor, no.
All right, we have much more to discuss. We can touch more on this in a second. Need to go to break. The conversation has just begun on whether Alaska should raise its minimum wage. When we come back, we will discuss whether its potential to reduce employment opportunities for Alaskans is possible and how it could spark wage inflation. We'll talk about that, and we'll try to figure out why there seems to be no real organized opposition to the proposed wage hike. Stay with us. Welcome back as we continue our discussion on whether Alaska should raise its minimum wage. Is something you'll be voting on when you head to the polls on November 4th. Our panel joining us tonight, the noes to my left, the yeses to my right when we take it widescreen. And when we left, we were discussing whether the state has a moral obligation to its people when it comes to the minimum wage. So the question for the yes side, Ed, why should the government get involved in determining what a small business pays its employer? Why not let the market be the determining factor?
Well, if we had a perfect market, which I don't think anybody would maintain we do, it might be a different argument. I think it's still appropriate for government to set a floor. That floor, unfortunately, has become a sub-basement both nationally and in Alaska with the rates we have now. Let me give you a quick story. I'm collecting signatures last year, right about a year ago right now, in Sitka, and outside of the post office, and woman comes up, says, "Oh, what is that? You know, I'll sign that." She says, "I have a gallery here, a lot of galleries, art galleries there, and actually most of them stay open year-round. They are signed." She says, "I pay my people $15 an hour. I don't see how anybody could expect someone to live on $7.75 in Alaska, in particular in Sitka." So she signs a petition. She had a shop there in Sitka and a seasonal one in Skagway for the tourists. A woman comes up about an hour later, same afternoon, almost the same story. I think she started her people around $12 an hour. Same feeling that, you know, there's no way you could expect them to live for $7.75. An hour later, I have a young woman come up and go, "Let me sign that. I make minimum wage and I can't make it. I can't get a place of my own." And she wasn't a teenager. She was in her 20s, starting life. And I said, "Well, where do you work?" "Oh, I work at that gift shop over there." She points to a third, art studios is what they were. So here's three competitors. Two of them are high road employers trying to do the right thing. And there's another employer paying in the same block, in the same industry, competing for the same customer dollars, paying the minimum allowed by law. That's why we need a law.
Kyle, the market, does it work? Is it flawed?
Well, of course, you know, going back to the question of whether or not the government has a moral responsibility to its citizens to make sure that those who are least worse off are taken care of, I actually do think that the government does have a moral role in that, but even absent that moral opinion, there's still an argument to be made about the betterment of the community that's necessary when taking care of our worst off within society that doesn't even require a moral argument. The question is, you know, whether or not our morality is based in terms of our intentions or in terms of the actual consequences that take place. Study after study demonstrates that the most vulnerable members of our society, those folks who have the most difficulty finding jobs, are the ones who tend to be adversely affected by these sorts of wage controls. And the disemployment effects and the unemployment effects are legion and have been demonstrated time after time. I think in terms of a moral issue that significantly complicates the minimum wage issue, there's no denying that certain people will absolutely be better off if we have a minimum wage. There's also no denying that many people will be much, much worse off if we have a minimum wage. And that definitely, for me, complicates the moral calculus when it comes to actually dealing with this issue.
What we've seen, most Alaskans, they're in favor of this minimum wage increase. Rachel, if you could, in your opinion, what is it when it boils down to it that they're not understanding as you see it?
I think Kyle put it well. There are winners and losers when you set an arbitrary floor, and I think he articulated it very well, so I'm not going to go there. But I think we have to understand as Alaskans that, you know, we don't just have businesses that are competing locally, we have businesses that are competing globally as well. And so, again, we always come back to the fundamental. Is it better for government to set this arbitrarily, or is it better for employers to do it? I mean, we're doing a great job. There's a lot of employers out there that are doing great, and I would encourage that young lady in Sitka to walk down the street and improve her skill set and go compete and get a better job with a competitor.
Or with a better employer.
Absolutely.
Anything you want to say to that?
I received my graduate degree from Claremont School of Theology in Southern California. And at that time, and that was a number of years ago, but I was so impressed by the lack of support for immigrants who were legal, immigrants who had resettled in Southern California, and how many of them had to have no transportation. You use government services to get most of their food and medical help, and certainly didn't have any of the amenities that so many of us can avail ourselves of. And I see that here back in Alaska as well. I'm a lifetime Alaskan, and I too have worked for minimum wage. Certainly could not afford to live on it. Had to have a roommate or two or three. And I would like to read you a comment that I came across from Senator Elizabeth Warren. And she said, had wages kept up with worker productivity over the years, the minimum wage today would be around $22 an hour. There's a big difference between a minimum wage and a living wage. And I think we have to take the first steps. Like any issues we have done in Alaska and across the country, we have to get started. And I don't think saying that this is not going to work. We have a saying in the church, we've never done it this way before. And I think that's kind of where we're falling into with if this minimum wage is not approved. I think we need to move forward.
Some would say having a wage is better than no wage, regardless of what it is. And the thinking is that if some smaller businesses need to pay their employees more, well, maybe they'll have less positions. Maybe they'll have to make some cuts. Is that fear there, that these people that are asking for the minimum wage now might not even be able to find a job?
I think that fear is there, but I think we are pretty incredible beings, and we can innovate and create and move past the roadblocks. And I would like to see that happen. I would like to see differing ways to help folks. And there's all sorts of ways to do that. But I do acknowledge the fear is there. But I think we have to overcome that fear. Courage is fear that has said its prayers.
If I may, James, thank you, Pastor. It's not like we've never done this before. And Kyle and I will stack studies up against each other. Somebody once said there could be a catastrophe in Washington. The last two people would be two labor economists walking down the street debating the employment effects of minimum wage. We've done this before. We've done this before in Alaska. We did exactly the same percentage increase in 2002, overnight, because we had lost a year when the legislature stalled on passing at that time. We had a 27% increase overnight with 7 months' notice. Employment went up the same level it had the year before and the year after overall, and in the low-wage industries identified by the Department of Labor as the main employers of minimum wage workers, seafood processing, so hotels, tourism, bars and restaurants, it went up even more. And of course the wages went up. So it was quality and more quantity of jobs at better quality. And it's happened every time it's been raised. These gloom and doom projections are raised and they don't happen. Why do we have to have a minimum wage? Because maybe if we didn't have any minimum wage, we'd only have more alleged J-1 visa workers from Bulgaria and other places in every restaurant in Fairbanks in the summer, because we don't have a wage that Alaskans can even afford to go to work for.
No, is it fear, or is it something that could be reality? I want to give you a chance to respond.
The realities are there are winners and losers, and so in an economy, which I will let the economists talk about, there's a give and take, cause and effect. It's very natural. So the very people that are the losers here are the folks who need the skills the most, the ones that Kyle referenced earlier. So I would,
it's. One of the things that's difficult in economics is actually parsing out all of the moving parts and finding out what causes what. To point to an anecdote about increases in the minimum wage in the past and to ignore the fact that wages have been skyrocketing in Alaska for quite a while in all fields because of the growth that we've seen. There's a reason why we do controlled studies in order to look at these things. And the controlled studies are very clear that when you increase the minimum wage, there are significant disemployment effects. That's just going to happen. It's important to state that even in those cases, most of those studies are done on short-term effects because those are easier to study. There's not as much change that's taking place. The real difficulty comes in the long run. In the short run, you pass a minimum wage. In the short run, most employers just say, okay, I have a particular way of doing things. I'm going to continue to do it that way with the employees that I've got. But that higher wage has those employers constantly looking for potential substitutes. You look at a place like France or Belgium and many places in Western Europe where they have very high minimum wages. And the result of that is massive, 20s, 30% youth unemployment in those places. And you also see in those places, especially in retail and restaurants, a move towards automation. And so the types of tablets that you're doing your orders on now at Red Robin here in Anchorage, that's been driven in large part by higher wages for those retail workers. If you raise those wages further, you can continue to see over time employers looking for those substitutes, and those substitutes often take the form of technological change. And again, McDonald's and Walmart are one of the few employers that are out there that are actually building their business around how to use very low-skilled workers. If you force them to raise their wages to essentially do the same thing that other employers are doing, the result of that is going to be that they're going to do things like Costco. They're going to use more automation and less employees, and it's going to make it more difficult for those folks, again, who are the most worse off. These immigrants that we're talking about, that I absolutely believe are a crucial part to the cultural fabric of Anchorage. Right. Discouraging these immigrants from coming to Anchorage, I think, is a terrible idea.
All right, well, we want to thank all of our panelists, especially those of you who have tuned into the conversation, which continues next week with a look at ballot measure 4, known as Bristol Bay Forever. Rhonda McBride will look at the pros and cons of putting Bristol Bay off limits to large-scale mining. She'll also talk with some veteran Alaska political observers and get their take on how record campaign spending is reshaping Alaska's political landscape. You can look for tonight's broadcast at KTVA.com and on demand from GCI. I'm James Gaddis. Thanks for being a part of the conversation.